Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Gwen Robinson, Senior Fellow at the Institute of Security and International Studies at Chulalongkorn University and Editor-at-Large of Nikkei Asia. We obviously know what we're all here to discuss today, but before we turn to the event itself, I'd really like to invite Dr. Prakong Siriprakop, Dean and Associate Professor of the Faculty of Political Science at Chulalongkorn University, just to give some opening remarks. Over to you, Ajahn.
Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. This seminar comes at a moment when the eyes of the world are keenly fixed on Myanmar, seeking signs of hope, pathways to peace, and the possibility of reconciliation within the nation that has been embroiled in profound turmoil. The coup d'etat of February 1st, 2021 marked a significant regression in Myanmar's journey towards democracy, plunging the country into a state of crisis characterized by political instability, civil unrest, and human suffering on an alarming scale. Over the last 3 years, we have witnessed a series of events that have not only reshaped the political landscape of Myanmar, but have also had far-reaching implications for regional stability, international law, and human rights. As we have entered the 4th year of this crisis, it is imperative to reflect on the journey thus far, to critically analyze the action taken by both national and international actors, and to assess their impacts on the ground. This seminar aims to explore viable paths to peace or the risk of further disintegration, examining domestic dynamics among various actors, as well as the roles that regional powers, international bodies, and civil society might play in forging a peaceful resolution. The situation in Myanmar holds particular relevance for Thailand, given our shared border of nearly 25 kilometers. The peace and stability of Myanmar directly affect Thailand, especially in terms of humanitarian obligations and managing cross-border issues. Moreover, Thailand's response to this crisis will be testament to its foreign policy effectiveness, diplomatic competence, and regional leadership. As we engage in this scholarly discussion, let us be driven by empathy, justice, and a relentless quest for peace. It is our shared duty to enrich the dialogue on Myanmar, striving not only to grasp the intricacy of its crisis, but also to identify concrete steps that can aid the Myanmar people in their struggle for democracy, peace, and dignity. I extend my gratitude to the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for backing such a commendable academic endeavor. Furthermore, I recognize our audience's crucial role. Without you, our forum would merely echo among academics and experts. Your presence and engagement are greatly valued. I hope our discussion proved enlightening and enriching for all. And thank you so much, everyone, for your participation and interest in coming today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ajahn. So turning to our topic of the day, which is entering the 4th year of the Myanmar crisis, a road to peace or disintegration. As you've heard, we've just marked 3 years since the coup of February 1, 2021 in Myanmar. And as Ajahn noted, we've seen spiraling violence, mass displacement, and economic decline. But now we have new momentum right here in Thailand on cross-border aid initiative that is being led by Thailand in a renewed and I think much more coordinated effort to revive momentum, regional momentum in ASEAN, to try and break this terrible deadlock. So I think for these excellent speakers, who I'll introduce in a moment, the big question today is, indeed, like the title of this panel, are we on a road to peace or disintegration? I suspect we're somewhere between those things, and perhaps the word disintegration doesn't quite sum it up. It's pretty brutal, but I'd say that's the question I hope our panelists will address. There will be time for questions at the end, so save those up for then. And just turning to introduce this excellent panel. At the far left is Dr. Titinan Pongsudhirak, my far left, Professor, Department of International Relations and Senior Fellow at ISIS Thailand, Faculty of Political Science at Chulalongkorn University. And then next to him is Nyanta Morlin, an independent analyst and also someone I knew many years ago in Myanmar, extremely connected and well informed about everything from agriculture to business. So we're very glad to have him with us today. Next to him is Dr. Lalita Hanwong, Assistant Professor, Department of History at the Faculty of Social Science at Kasetsart University. And right next to me is Dr. Matthew Arnold, academic and independent policy analyst and former Asia Foundation head in Myanmar, amongst many other things. So I'd like to start with Dr. Titinan. Jay, over to you. Maybe you can launch the discussion.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. I think that we were talking about how to divide up the panel. So I think that maybe I would concentrate on the global context, the regional dimensions, regional dynamics, and then maybe looking at Thai policy on Myanmar, 3 tiers. In about 10 minutes, Gwen? Okay. So first, this is a little bit of an exciting time, but an exciting time because the ground is shifting in Myanmar. Things are happening, things are changing. Situation is transforming, but it's nothing to be too excited about because the situation, the reality in Myanmar remains stark, dark, violent, and deadly. This is the first coup. Just over 3 years ago, there was a power grab. There was a military takeover. And after 3 years, Myanmar is up for grabs, which means that the future is uncertain. The title here is Peace or Disintegration. I think a working, functional peace or something else. It does not have to be disintegration. It could be disconnectivity. We will see. But certainly, the situation now is not what it was 3 years ago. This is the first military coup in Southeast Asia and the wider world, which has succeeded in its execution, but failed in its implementation, which means that there was a coup on February 1st, 2021. Normally, in Thailand, we've had coups. 2006, 2014, when there's a coup, if it succeeds, then it moves forward, it moves on, which means that if there's a failed coup, we've had failed coups in Thailand. Thailand's a good example. We had a lot of coup attempts. We've had 13 successful coups and another almost a dozen coup attempts that failed. We had a failed coup in 1981, failed coup in 1985, successful coup in 1991, successful coups in 2006, 2014. Myanmar, they had successful coups in 1962, 1988. Indonesia had a successful coup in 1965. Cambodia had a failed coup in 1997. So there's a lot of coups in Southeast Asia, but once it succeeds, it's successfully executed. That's it. So a lot of people 3 years ago thought, there's a new authority in town in Myanmar, a central authority, the Tatmadaw, we called it back then. They took over after the election in November 2020 and all the controversy. And there's a lot of debate about, who was at fault, why there was a coup. And, we can go into that in some detail later. But it has failed because it has failed to consolidate territory. And it has failed to impose its rule on its people. So right after the coup, there was a pushback movement, initially called a civil disobedience movement, and protesting against the coup. And then there was a very heavy, violent suppression that led to that exacerbated the resistance, the anti-coup movement, and then eventually it mushroomed, it spread, and it formed, organized into the People's Defense Force, working with the EAOs, and I think most of us, all of us here, would know about the PDFs and the EAOs and the CDM, CRPH, and all of that. We have a lot of acronyms here, but I want to get back to the global context. So after the coup, most people thought, okay, let's move on, including ASEAN. The international community opposed the coup, of course. The US, EU, Japan, all kinds of countries. Japan maybe less than it should have been. ASEAN was ASEAN was divided at the outset about the reactions to the coup. Right away, if you go back to look at the record, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia were at the forefront, calling for the restoration of democratic dialogue, democratic process. Thailand was not on that side initially. And the global international community, the UN, US, and so on, they deferred the Myanmar situation to the Myanmar coup and crisis to ASEAN. And ASEAN wanted to be the main player, the main mediator, facilitator to help resolve this crisis. So March, April, eventually, after some weeks of dithering, ASEAN came together. I think it was April 22nd, 2021. Brunei was the chair. They came up with a 5-point consensus. And a 5-point consensus was, demanded calling for cessation of violence and provision of humanitarian assistance and promotion of dialogue with an ASEAN envoy who would lead an ASEAN delegation to visit Myanmar and speak to inclusively all stakeholders involved, including Aung San Suu Kyi. That never happened. So the international community, I think, had its hands tied a little bit because ASEAN would not, and this happened at the UN international negotiations. ASEAN wanted to look after this Myanmar crisis, and the international community always has a lot of issues on its agenda. There are crises everywhere. And when the US, EU, UN, they look at Southeast Asia, Myanmar is the top item. They don't look at Thailand. Thailand now may be attracting a little bit of attention. South China Sea certainly attracts a lot of attention. But in the main, Myanmar is an ongoing project, if you will, of the international community. I mean, Myanmar was a kind of a Hollywood story. A lot of people followed it. There were movies made of Aung San Suu Kyi's struggle, and people knew about her. She was iconic. She won a Nobel Peace Prize in 1991, and it was kind of the good versus evil. It was stuff that movies are made of, right? You have a military dictatorship suppressing its own people for 5 decades, and then had reform and open up, and there she was, the icon, the prodigal daughter of the founder of the country, came back and became eventually leader of the country. After a decade, all of that was unplugged. So the international community had a lot of issues, deferred to ASEAN. So, and this even was compounded, even more evident after the Russian invasion of Ukraine about a year later. What has ASEAN do? My second point. What has ASEAN done? Not very much. Not very much. And ASEAN, it's been divided on a range of issues already prior to the Myanmar coup and crisis and civil war. After the 5-point consensus was launched, nothing happened. Cambodia took up the chairmanship in 2022, and Prime Minister Hun Sen, the first thing he did after taking power was to go over to Naypyidaw. He thought that, as a strong man, he can talk to another strong man, and Min Aung Hlaing, and then they would, he knows how to do it. he failed. He came back, and I think he just he was very dismissive, and he was disappointed, of course, but it was a loss of faith for Hun Sen, because he took it upon himself, to conduct his personal diplomacy with Min Aung Hlaing. He got nothing in return. He said no precondition and nothing in return. So now, 2022 went by. The civil war in the meantime. After a year, it became a stalemate. The resistance became stronger and stronger. More coordination, better armed, better trained, better coordination with the ethnic armed organizations, and it became a real force, a real resistance army. A motley army, really mixed. You got the PDFs everywhere. They're all kind of small units, and they have the backing of the umbrella of the national unity government. So it was becoming, after a year, an alternative state with an armed wing, an army of EAOs, very diverse, and also on the PDFs, very fierce, but also very unorganized, organized into disparate units around the country. So this civil war, when it became a stalemate after a year, what ASEAN should have done and what Thailand should have been to start hedging its bets. Hedging its bets meaning don't bet on the military junta, the State Administration Council, SAC only. You have to start thinking that, hey, the other side could win. But ASEAN didn't really do that. Thailand definitely did not do that. Thailand made it worse, went the wrong way. We shall go into it in a bit. So this, over time, second year, right? As the second year wore on, the civil war shifted. The resistance got the upper hand. And they got the upper hand, it's logical in a way. You think, how can a battle-tested, battle-hardened army been fighting internal conflicts for decades? How can it lose to this, a bunch of village youth, urban young people who had no military background? And the ethnic armies, well, they already had been fighting the Tatmadaw for a long time. Tatmadaw could handle them. But here is where I think the war shifted. For the first time, the Myanmar military, had to fight not a one-front war against the ethnic armies, but a two-front war against its own people. The PDFs were the key. Had the PDF had the Burma majority of people did not turn against the military, we wouldn't be in this situation where the military is actually losing. So the PDFs were key. Basically the logic is once you start fighting with the whole country, when the country turns against you in a nationwide revolt, fierce, determined, your days are numbered. So eventually, in the third year, the tide has shifted, and especially since last October, the various ethnic armies, together with PDFs, they have overran bases, outposts, military outposts in the north, in Shan State, and then now they are on the offensive. They are taking the war to the military. We don't call them Tatmadaw anymore, but the armed forces of Myanmar have their backs against the wall. For ASEAN now, after so much dithering and having all these meetings and coming up with nothing, divided already over US-China, South China Sea, even Russia-Ukraine, now divided over Myanmar. Now ASEAN has a second chance to be an effective, consequential player in this mix, and I think the international community will still defer to ASEAN because it just makes more sense. The international community, US, EU, UN, they don't have the equipment, the assets, the resources, the wherewithal to facilitate, mediate the Myanmar civil war and crisis. So now ASEAN, I think, there was a meeting in Luang Prabang, and ASEAN is very happy that they had this non-political representative from Myanmar, which to me is a concession, is a sign that the Myanmar armed forces are losing. For over 2 years, they didn't send anyone. ASEAN had to leave an empty chair at the summit, at the leaders level and also the foreign ministers level, repeatedly. So finally now, the SAC has sent someone, a non-political, quote-unquote non-political, which means a PubSec, senior official, not at the junta level. So ASEAN should feel heartened, but it should not feel should not feel complacent. It should not feel triumphant. It hasn't done anything. I think that the PDFs and the EAOs did the heavy lifting with the NUG's umbrella coordination. So what ASEAN should do next, in my view, is what is an ongoing negotiations bargaining process. Having the non-political representative now, ASEAN should build on this to capitalize on this and to try to engage not just with SAC, but also the NUG and EAOs. And EAOs are a wide mix, so they have to identify which of the EAOs are the key players, and then the PDFs have to be included. They did really the heavy lifting, and then this is the Troika modality can provide a way forward. So Laos is the chair. Indonesia has elections, so we're not going to see a new cabinet until October. But Malaysia is in, and Thailand now. My third point now with a newly elected government under the Seta, Thaksin, the Prime Minister, Ban Pri, the Foreign Minister, Thailand has qualitatively, fundamentally shifted its posture and position now on Myanmar. And it was just a wrong policy for Thailand, for Myanmar, for everybody for a long time since the beginning of the coup. We had the previous government of Prayut. Prayut was very close to Min Aung Hlaing. Min Aung Hlaing, wrote a letter to Prayut, seeking support right after the coup. Tatmadaw, Thai army, very close. The foreign minister, Don Pramat Vinay, had a special advisor named Pornpimon Kanchanalak. I have to mention this. They did deep damage to Thai foreign policy, on Thai Myanmar policy. They provided legitimacy for the SAC. Now, in the beginning, they're not, it's understandable the first year because you had a coup. Normally, the coup have a coup government. So you have to play along with, this coup government, SAC. But after a year, when they became a stalemate, Thailand should have started shifting its position, hedging a little bit. Hey, the military may not win. It's very difficult to think that the military coup that succeeds, would fail. Right? It is very difficult to succeed. Even today, a lot of Thai officials, they still cannot believe, they cannot get their heads around the fact that the Myanmar armed forces are not going to win. This has become an unwinnable war for them. So now the new government, after Don and Kun Don and Pornpimon provided all this track 1.5 and ministerial meetings, undermining the ASEAN 5-point consensus. I think they should be investigated for the the performance and also the potential behind the scenes negotiations with the private sector and so on. I don't know what we have to get to the bottom of it in a proper investigation, but it was a wrong policy. So now new government, new shift. I think that we have seen qualitative shift. The vice minister, foreign minister, and Thailand now is on the side of Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and Singapore. So you have the original 5 ASEAN members on the same side. And this could be the core, the catalyst for the kind of negotiations and mediation facilitation moving forward. I do think one thing, just to wrap up, ASEAN should also go on the offensive a little bit. It has been taken for a ride. I wrote about that in April 2021. ASEAN was taken for a ride, but now that the SAC is buckling a little bit, ASEAN should go on the offensive, put more pressure on the SAC. And one thing it could do is to demand the unconditional release of Aung San Suu Kyi. Now, unconditional release of Aung San Suu Kyi, and she's almost 80, she's ill, she could go, she could pass, and she has suffered enough. There are 2 reasons for that. First, on humanitarian grounds, that she has suffered, she's ill, she's in solitary confinement. It's outrageous. Second, it's not for her to come back and lead the movement or resistance. It's beyond her, and she'd made mistakes, and she did many things that have been criticized. And her life, this is a lifelong struggle for her, and she's been quietly suffering in jail. So I think the second reason is for her to come out as a kind of a ceremonial, symbolic figure behind the resistance movement. There's no one like her still in this world who can still has that stature, that iconic background that people can look up to, not to lead the movement, but at least someone that they can all identify with. So that would be my call, Gwen, and in this first round. Thank you very much. So ASEAN has a second chance to do things right. International community, I think, will still defer to ASEAN, and the international community has done a lot. All the US sanctions, EU sanctions, they mattered. They mattered. But now ASEAN and then also Thailand is a key country here. And now with the new government, all kinds of things can happen. But make no mistake, I mean, nothing to be too excited about, because the future is up for grabs.
Thanks very much, Ajahn, for a particularly succinct and I think highly relevant set of comments, which I think provide a lot of food for thought. In fact, taking your point about it was quite a striking point about the coup that was succeeded in execution and failed in implementation. I think the other thing to cite the words of paraphrase the late Henry Kissinger. I think the military that hasn't won is losing, and the resistance that hasn't lost is winning, and that's also the situation, I think. Anyway, perhaps we'll now turn to Dr. Lalita for your comments, please.
Good morning.
Just maybe up to 8 to 10 minutes.
Okay, I'll try to be as concise as possible. I have many points I'd like to tell you today. This morning, first of all, just a bit more about myself. I also work as an advisor to the Committee of Border Affairs and National Security at the Thai Parliament. It's the legislative branch of the Thai government. I don't know exactly what my committee could do. I mean, to put a bit more pressure to the government on the Myanmar issue, but we try our best to advise and to give thoughtful recommendations as much as possible. Within this committee, we also have another subcommittee. Let me try to translate into English quickly for you. This is a subcommittee appointed to seek solutions for refugees and irregular migrants, Myanmar displaced persons, and Myanmar people fleeing the unrest. This subcommittee is chaired by Kun Manop. He's an MP from Move Forward Party, and he's an ethnic Karen himself. So I've been a part of this subcommittee, and very recently, this morning exactly, the first draft of a report prepared by this subcommittee was released on, basically how to solve problems and more recommendations for the government regarding displaced people coming from Myanmar. Okay, I have a few points here. If it's too long, when you can stop me, okay? But these are my observations. First of all, I think that the Operation 1027, since last October 2023, has unveiled a few things which are crucial to understand the future of Myanmar. We need to understand first and foremost that since Myanmar gained independence in 1948, there has never been sustainable peace in this country whatsoever. Because I think the military's idea is that they are the guardian of peace, they are the protector of unity and integration of Myanmar, and of the fact that Myanmar never succeeded in holding any peace talk with all ethnic parties on board. The well-acclaimed Panglong Conference, which I think is overrated, sorry about that, only included a few larger ethnic groups and exacerbated the differences between the so-called the lowlanders and the highlanders, rather than trying to incorporate all ethnic groups in this agreement. So if one needs to secure peace, the next phase must be as collective and inclusive as possible. I understand that one of the greatest challenges is how to build trust among various ethnic groups vis-a-vis the NUG and other Burma-oriented entities. My second point is never in modern Myanmar history that the military has become so weak and disintegrated with very high rates of desertion, defeat after defeat, and lack of confidence in a Tamador like this. Even for those right-wing pro-military nationalists, we see more and more, maybe it's just the propaganda, but I can see signs that even the most extreme, nationalist people, they are losing hope in the Myanmar army as well. It is certain that the military cannot go on like this. I agree with all commentators that they are losing like never before because they virtually have no support inside and out, except from some countries, and the resistance has gained more control, more momentum over larger territories. Only parts of Burma proper is now left, but who knows how long this is going to last. My third point is, let me go to the joint statement of NUG, which was released just a few days ago. And they released this statement together with the three revolutionary groups, namely the Chin National Front, the Karenni Kaya National Progressive Party, and the Karen National Union. This particular move is very important for me because it brings us to the understanding of the dynamics of alliance or alliances among resistant groups in Myanmar now. However, as always the case in Myanmar, some groups have been left out, like the KIA, the Kachins, the AA, the Arakanese or the Rakhines, or even some smaller groups like NMSP, the Mons, let alone the heavily fractured Shan states. I think there is a big issue of trust here. I try to ask my journalist friend, my analyst friend, what is going on among KIA, AA, for example. I don't think we should rush here, and I don't think that we should be too alarmed that these groups are not signing the joint statement released by the NUG right now. Maybe they don't trust NUG and the process now, but who knows, in the future, maybe there'll be more dialogues coming in the next couple of weeks or a couple of months, and trust, cannot be gained in a matter of days. It has to be gained over time. And maybe some groups, they just want to wait and see. My fourth point, during the last couple of months, we have seen emerging interests from Myanmar neighbors like China as a peace broker, moves from other countries, neighboring countries like Bangladesh and Thailand have been felt and noticed as well. Both countries, Bangladesh and Thailand, who have been far from being proactive on the foreign policy front, have not engaged fully with non-state actors in Myanmar yet. And they have all the more chosen to still adhere to Naypyidaw. I hope this will change very soon. Despite its dramatic decline of the Myanmar military, both Thailand and Bangladesh prefer to secure their good relations with SAC. For Bangladesh, they have this extremely important issue of the Rohingyas and the repatriation of thousands and thousands of Rohingyas at the forefront of their foreign policy with Myanmar, whereas Thailand does not want to lose their privileges of brother-like relationship with SAC and the Myanmar army. I have been told numerous times by Thai diplomats and policymakers that Thailand cannot fully adopt ASEAN stance on Myanmar simply because the rest of ASEAN countries do not share 2,400 kilometer long border with Myanmar. And I'm sure I will be hearing this again, time and time again. My fifth point, I think what happens in Myanmar now has great impact on Thailand. And it's an experiment, it's a test on the courage, guts that Thai foreign policy makers would have. Just imagine this: we have 2 to 3 million legal Myanmar workers here, let alone 2 to 3 million well, rather illegal or maybe irregular workers. So all in all, we probably have 6 to 7 million Myanmar workers here in this country. If only a fraction of them decides to go on strike for just one day, in Thailand, the economy in Mahachai, in Ramatu area, Masot and beyond would be put on a standstill immediately. I have been trying my best to encourage the Thai state, both the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Thai army, to take more solid stance on Myanmar and don't just rely on the Tatmadaw. I understand this very well. They don't want to lose their close relationships with SAC because, basically Thailand is the only country in the world right now who is trusted by SAC. Okay. I think I have one or two more points. I'll go through this very quickly. You may know that now the MFA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Thailand, they have just released the humanitarian corridor policy, but it's still very, very limited. And I think that this work is still ongoing. They haven't consulted any ethnic groups or any working groups, even though we have lots of ethnic people living not just in Masot and Chiang Mai, but also in Bangkok. But they haven't been consulted whatsoever. I think that this needs to change. This policy directs 100% on Myanmar people, refugees. So Thailand needs to be more proactive and just be more courageous in talking with ethnic groups as much as they can now. Thailand needs to be more brave and just try to get out of the box here. Okay, my last point is I have a few concerns of the problems that will emerge from the attempt to create the so-called democratic federalism in Myanmar. Number one that I can think of is the demarcation of constituent units. Right now, many states haven't been properly demarcated yet, and this would be big issues. I'm a colonial historian. I mean, I wasn't born in the colonial period, but I worked on colonial Burma, Myanmar, and I know that it took the British decades to demarcate just a fraction of territories in Myanmar. So if the real solid federalism has to be organized and established in the future, this would really be a big issue. Right now, many ethnic groups want to create their own constitution, charter, whatever you want to call it, which is not necessarily in line with that of NUG. There is a huge challenge of how you could reconcile different factions in these ethnic groups and parties. The Chins now, for example, they have CNF, they have Chin Land Council, they have Interim Chin National Consultative Council. They don't necessarily agree on key issues. The challenge right now in the post-junta era is, for me, I think it's a reconciliation more than anything among ethnic groups and how they could build trust over time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ajahn. Lots of thoughts there that I hope we will return to. And meanwhile, I think we'll hand over now to Matt Arnold with, I think you have a PowerPoint, Matt. Do you want to sit here? Yeah, so we'll just swap so Matt can show his PowerPoint with a close-up on the security situation on the ground. One of the best analysts and number crunchers I've come across on monitoring the Myanmar conflict. Over to you.
Thank you, Gwen, and thank you to ISIS for hosting me today. I want to take a step back to look at the wider military situation, and I think that my premise for that is because I mean, fundamentally, this is a country at war, and what happens through the war, how the war unfolds, is a key determinant to what happens next in terms of politics, in terms of stability, et cetera, et cetera. So my simple point is that we have to understand how this is happening, and that's one of the best indicators of what might come next in terms of peace or disintegration. Just by background, since the coup, I've been tracking what I call conflict incidents, cataloged over 53,000 of them. So I'll be presenting that data today. If you have methodology questions, we can talk about that later. But what I want to do is kind of lay out how this is unfolding, and then conclude with some discussion about what that means in terms of peace or disintegration. The map on the left is a presentation of conflict incidents over 2021. In 2021, the big question was, would there be resistance? Would it be nationwide? The answer was yes. The question in 2022, the map on the right, was, would the junta crush the resistance? The answer was no. You can see that compared to 2022, we have a lot darker colors, meaning that the scope and prevalence of resistance increased markedly over the course of 2022. And in fact, it became very saturated across the country, including not just in areas with ethnic armed organizations, but across the Myanmar heartland. The question in 2023 was, so what? Does this lead to anything, or do we just have a country perpetually at war? I think what we see now is we're getting to the questions of, will the junta collapse? In fact, this is the question of 2024. Will the junta collapse? How does it collapse? And how does that in turn lead to what happens next? But what we've seen over 2023 was still an even greater increase in armed resistance and escalation, especially through Operation 1027 in northern Shan. But we have to be clear that even before Operation 1027, this is just an illustration using the previous 4 months, that armed resistance was still very, very prominent across the country, both in the north, but also across the southeast, meaning that the military had to fight across the vast swath of the country. When we got to Operation 1027 itself, of course, we saw the large increase in fighting across northern Shan over November. This escalated further through December, but then we also saw the increase in armed resistance as the AA kicked off in Rakhine. But then again, we've seen very determined resistance across large parts of the country, aside from just what falls directly under Operation 1027. To the point where we are talking now about the loss of towns and the loss of territory, I like to be clear that even before Operation 1027 and the loss of towns, there were large parts of the country where the military was already losing rural areas. I mean, if you look at Sagaing through 2023, there were numerous townships where the military had lost upwards of 80% of a township. So when 1027 happened, of course, we have a lot of towns that have been lost in northern Shan, across Chin, now towns lost in Rakhine and Karenni, but also in Sagaing. In terms of the overall trajectories, I just want to highlight a couple points, starting with the visual in the center. I mean, this is just a presentation of total conflict incidents month by month since the start of armed resistance, as it were, distinct to what's been termed the Spring Revolution in April of 2021. What we see is that there's been a very steep slope in terms of armed resistance. You can see the spike on the right in terms of Operation 1027. I have the January numbers, but I haven't been able to turn them into visuals yet, but this has increased further. The point here has always been that, to Ajahn Tidhanand's point, that this has been a national uprising. That's been consistent throughout. And this has always been the core reality that has confronted the military. Any military in the world would find it very difficult to suppress a national uprising. And the military, despite using atrocious amounts of what I would consider systematic violence, has never been able to quell the resistance. And this the bar chart on the left speaks to this point, that it's also been across the Bamar heartland. In terms of how I code conflict incidents, Sagaing has been incredibly saturated with resistance. Magway, Mandalay, these are all Bamar heartland regions. But then we also have exceptional amounts of resistance in places like Karen State, Karenni, etc. In terms of just the overall breakdown of conflict incidents, I recode them in different ways. The blue is resistance attacks on the military. Green is military attacks on the resistance. Red is military violence against civilians. And gray is other. Other meaning nonviolent acts that are significant to understanding conflict. What I just want to highlight here is that this military has not fought a war in the conventional sense. I mean, to the point of calling it a military is an open question. This is an armed entity that overwhelmingly has committed mass violence against civilians. And if you strip that aside of ethics, morality, international law, et cetera, the point is also that it hasn't been effective. Right? Resistance has become saturated and it's never been pacified. Just a trend line looking at these four subtypes of what I call conflict incidents. Again, blue being resistance attacks. What I want to highlight is that this is looking at the last 10 months of 2023. If you look at the red line, what we see towards October onwards was a massive escalation in military violence against civilians. Military violence against civilians has been exceptionally intense, widespread since the beginning, but it's escalated even further in the last couple months. Over January, this would have gone up even higher. This is a breakdown further of military violence against civilians. Just to highlight a key point here, the top one, the kind of orangish red, is ground raids on villages, communities using military units. What we can see over November, December, it had come down quite a bit. In turn, the yellow is artillery strikes on civilian communities, blue is air attacks on civilian communities, meaning that as the military has been weakened, it is resorting to military assets to target civilians, primary artillery shelling and airstrikes. A further point is that as this thing progresses, it's becoming increasingly urban. No military in the world wants to be forced into a war that's primarily in urban areas. But the fact that this military, this junta, is having to face that reality is quite stark. And I give Sagaing as an example of this. It's at the top. Over December of 2023, 50% of resistance attacks were in urban areas. So this is not a situation where the trend is of a military that is still able to operate across large swaths of territory. It is increasingly forced into a defensive posture to keep urban areas and focus on key logistics routes. Just one last slide of some just military analysis, and I'll get to the wider question. I think a key thing to understand here in terms of what's happened in Myanmar is the role of roads and control of roads, and then the taking of towns. Now, some towns aren't particularly significant. Some of them are much more significant, even if they're small. The key dynamic in all of this is how the resistance has been able to take key towns that are crossroads, and that fundamentally what's happening to the military is it's being isolated and fragmented. That's the map on the left. The black is roads where the military still has freedom of movement. Yellow is roads where there's a good likelihood of attack. Red is where it's pretty guaranteed that the military will be attacked. And purple are roads that the military has lost outright. If you then look at the map on the right, you can see quite clearly that what is happening is that the military is being forced into these core areas, this core kind of center of the country. I would highlight a key point, though, which is that the notion that the military can just retreat into the central part of the country and everything will be hunky-dory is not going to happen, because the military already faces exceptional amounts of resistance inside key areas of the country. I mean, if you look at the green area of the map, what has happened is that there's, on either side of the Goyoma, Myanmar is a north-south country. The two main axes of Myanmar run north-south on either side of the Irrawaddy. The junta is now having to fight on both sides of this of the Goyoma. That means that things like the Yangon Mandalay Highway are being pressured, but then likewise, even on the western side of the Goyoma going up into Magwe, there's an incredible amount of resistance. So I question the notions that the Myanmar military can just retreat and go into a defensive posture in the center of the country. Let me conclude with just a couple slides of takeaways. I mean, the first one is the junta is losing. That's not quite the same as saying the junta will lose, but as of the current dynamics trend, the junta is losing. It's at a distinct risk of being enveloped. It faces too much resistance in too many parts of the country. It's spread too thin. Its ability to respond, adapt is collapsing. I mean, the clearest example of that is since Operation 1027, the military has not been able to mount a coherent counteroffensive anywhere. The second thing is the resistance spans the population. I think this is an important point for the wider question of the seminar, which is this is a resistance that includes the Bamar majority and numerous ethnic minority populations. This is a historic development. I think it's an incredibly important reality. In terms of international, in terms of the international reality, the junta can't control the border. I mean, images of junta troops fleeing into China, Bangladesh, India have become routine. And then, as I just alluded to, the walls are closing. This isn't out just on the periphery. There's fighting immediately to the north and east of Mandalay, or northeast of Mandalay. There's fighting immediately to the east and south of Naypyidaw. There is fighting to the east of Yangon City. So any notion that this is out in the countryside and in the far periphery are not accurate. So the bottom line in all of this is a simple reality, which is that the junta will lose control over territory that it doesn't actively defend, and then for all intents and purposes, the junta can't retake territory that it's lost. In terms of just final thoughts and a wrap up, I mean, just strategic considerations. As I said, 2024, the question is, will the junta collapse? How does it collapse? Out of these points, I would just flag two couple things. One is that the wider regional rationale, strategic rationale regarding Myanmar is shifting. I mean, for China to have one EAO controlling one side of the corridor, another EAO controlling the other side of the corridor, it's an open question, what exactly is the point of the junta in all of this? The other issue, for instance, for countries like India or Bangladesh as well, is like, at what point does the junta also lose its value when they can't control the border? This is also increasingly a question for Thailand. Then the other thing that I would flag here, just two points. I think we have to give some credit to different parts of the resistance that they have demonstrated and comparatively a historic level of negotiation, dialogue, engagement. I did my PhD on conflict studies. I worked in many different countries. I can't think of any comparable example from the last 30, 40 years of a country that's been through what it's been through that has anything approaching the kind of political solidarity and public support that we see in Myanmar to get rid of this military and create a different country. And so I think we do have to give credit to that. Often we're very cynical and starkly so in terms of what I would call a paternalistic cynicism about Myanmar. And that what they have achieved in Myanmar is remarkable by any standard. A further point towards that is that there is this is what I would call a bottom-up revolution. It started from the bottom up. It started from the population. There's no single revolutionary party. It started because communities on the ground didn't want to go back to military dictatorship, and they resisted. Some point is very simple. People want change. Challenge in all of this in terms of 2024 is that the military will continue to use exceptional amounts of violence to the point where I think the military will, in effect, and has already started to do so, which is to take towns and cities hostage, threatening to burn them to the ground if there's resistance. The overall some point would be that there is a need to support federal democracy because it's in the region's strategic political economic interest. Just a couple final points. I agree with Tony Davis in one of his last op-eds where he said, Rakhine is central. How Rakhine falls will in the next, if it falls, how it falls in the next 4, 6, 8 weeks. This will have a massive impact on the overall viability of the junta. If Rakhine falls quickly, the military will fall much quicker. I think it's in everybody's interest to see this military collapse as quickly as possible. I would also just summarize with a few points in terms of the future. One is that we must accept some ambiguity about what comes next. We've always had fairly myopic, what I would consider somewhat detached projections of what we would like to see in Myanmar to the extreme, either way. We think it's this wonderful place with iconic leaders and everything good is going to happen there, to swing into the other extreme where everything is absolutely horrendous, nothing good can ever happen. I think we have to be a little bit pragmatic and accept that there will be ambiguity in what comes next, and that we also have to be patient. A lot can go wrong, things will go wrong, but we also have to accept that a lot can go right. And for me, I say in terms of what's happening in Myanmar, in terms of strategy, we shouldn't obsess completely on what can go wrong. We should also focus on what can go right and support it. Towards that, I would say key to all of this is an open question. I have my own answer to it, but what is a critical mass of the country to keep the Myanmar project, to use Jay's term, going in terms of there will be outliers, especially in the near term. There will be statelets, there will be groups that say we want confederal versus federal. This is to be expected. I mean, in Nepal, when they had their peace agreement, they hadn't even defined the borders of the federal units. In the U.S., all the states had constitutions before we had a federal constitution, and we didn't get that till 11 years after the war. So I think in all of this, we have to be somewhat pragmatic about what can happen. I think we also have to accept that there's going to be a certain organic logic to what happens. Like we always assume that all the chess pieces are already on the board, and that we just, we kind of see who's there, and from that we make fairly stark diagnoses about what can happen. A lot is happening very quickly. What we have to accept is that this is going to play out, it's going to take time, and that there's going to be a logic to it, but that a lot of that logic is not clear to us yet. It'll emerge. And I think the concluding point would be that the only reason that the resistance came this far, because most people didn't think it would get this far either. Now we think whatever comes next will be only bad. So I think we have to give some credit that they only got this far because it was a national effort involving many different actors. Whatever comes next will also have the same dynamic, that if it's to succeed, it needs to support engagement across the country. But there is a precedent for having positive collective action within Myanmar, and we owe them the benefit of the doubt to give it a go. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Matt, also for all the incredibly detailed mapping and number crunching. Actually, before we move on, I'd just like to follow up on one of your figures, which was interesting. You said 94% of, I think, was it towns or townships were affected. Did you mean by conflict? Because that's kind of, I wonder what the criteria is. The UN published a figure last week or 2 weeks ago that 60% of all townships were affected in some way by conflict. But again, it wasn't clear what the criteria is. What do you mean affected? Having just been in Myanmar myself, it was quite extraordinary that in some towns, you know, and particularly in Yangon, you would not know that the countryside's burning up unless someone told you. So I'm just curious about that.
I mean, as I said, I could different types of conflict incidents. Not all of them are violent. The way I see it is that over the course of the year, this was 90+% of townships have had exceptional types of events that are part of a wider conflict. That doesn't necessarily mean active armed resistance, but there's different types of exceptional events that mean that the junta does not have stable control, uncontested control, or there is a population that has submitted to military rule.
Right.
And this, again, just speaks to the wider point that this has been a national uprising. And I've always said, I mean, if you're part of the resistance in Myanmar, it doesn't actually mean you just have to be part of the PDFs and EROs. There's a wide array of other types of resistance.
Right, so that's not necessarily violent. I mean, they're not all violent. Yeah. Thank you. So our last but very not least, turning to Nyanta Morlin, for your view, also as our only Myanmar speaker from Myanmar. So over to you, please.
Thank you, Gwen. Sorry, I have a little bit of a sore throat, but I'll try to work through this. I'm just going to go back to the heading that started this, right? Peace or disintegration. And I think the question I will start with is whether those two things are in opposition to each other. I think a lot of my fellow speakers have covered most of the key issues I wanted to talk about, but just to recap, fundamentally what is going on is a revolution and resistance to military rule. This is fundamentally what's seen as the root cause of all issues in the country. But I think it's also important for the sake of future discussions, both within the country among the various political actors, but also externally, particularly in the region, in how neighbors and other stakeholders approach Myanmar. It's also important to tease apart what that means when we say the military is the root cause of all problems in Myanmar. What I want to say is that we're talking about a legacy of authoritarianism, of, as Matt has said, the willingness to resort to systematic use of violence on civilians. It's been mismanagement also, right? And the absolute failure to develop any kind of meaningful state institutions. There's been no significant or noteworthy exercise in the building of a state and of a nation in Myanmar. And when we say nation building, what we've had and what you see a lot of the key political actors resist is this very facile, but also very problematic turn to a kind of what now you will find in the common parlance within resistance actors is Bama chauvinism, and meaning a reliance on the majority identity as the basis for a national identity. And I think communities in the country, the peoples in the country, and certainly all the key political and armed actors in the country are ready to undo and overturn that. I also want to talk about the framing, I think, and how we talk about Myanmar. And Matt, I wanted to just touch, I agreed with everything you presented, but even the terminology of the fall of Rakhine, right? Or the collapse of the state, power vacuum. This is what is being discussed today, especially since the late last year with regards to Myanmar. But that's not necessarily the perspective on the ground, and that's not necessarily the perspective of Burmese political stakeholders. This isn't state failure. There has never been a meaningful state that the people and the communities of the country could engage with. And this is very evident in current local ground discourse about the state, not just during this period, but I will argue even over the past decade, when we witnessed an attempt at a military-designed transition. And what I mean is the state was always an entity that was to be held back or held at bay by local communities, never necessarily a provider of what we would expect in terms of governance, in terms of public goods, service delivery. And if it is the military that is the state, you will see that there's no real disagreement with the idea that that should collapse. But of course, I think then the framing should be what really are the needs, right? What really are the needs, what's been lacking. And I think that's how we get to this idea of where can peace come from. And I would posit is that I think moving forward, we do need to bring up a discussion of governance, right? We do need to bring up a discussion of service delivery. We do need to talk about rights and liberties. I find that both the domestic but also the international discourse on Myanmar tends to frame it often and too willingly as an issue of identity politics. That's certainly there, but that's a conflation, in my view, of all the various other problematic issues that have come about with this legacy of military rule. And again, not military rule. I really appreciate what you said, Matt. It's ruled by a very particular kind of organization, right, over the past 70 years. So if we are able to bring back a discourse, and we need to constantly, on the importance of rights and the importance of liberties, and what is the framing in terms of political representation, self-determination, then those two things aren't necessarily in opposition. Even, I will posit, we sometimes, within this revolution and within resistance and revolutionary actors, the idea, I think there's a jump to potential solutions, right? Federal democracy is posited as a solution, and it may very well be. But I think it would be helpful to come back to what the actual needs are, right? And then how you address those needs may allow for a bit more flexibility and I think a bit more pragmatism. And if the needs are the right to self-determination, are the rights and liberties of individuals in the country that we have not really had a chance to experience under rule by the Burmese military. If the needs are justice, right, for the decades of atrocities and other kinds of, again, systematic discrimination, it's not just the failure for any kind of nation building under rule by this military organization. It's also the weaponization of race, of religion in Myanmar that has been unaddressed. And then, yes, peace is a need. And I think when we frame needs for Myanmar on those terms, how we approach solutions and how we think of possible trajectories will allow a lot more space. I think it will also lessen some of the perceived tensions, will allow us overcoming perceived conflicts of interest, and also take away from some of the framing that still pervades the discourse. The military is not part of the picture, right? And when I talk about dialogue, I think that's evident. But I think that also creates this unnecessary fear in the region, I think among neighbors and international community, in terms of, is this resistance movement pragmatic? Are they being realistic? Do they really want to wipe out or collapse this institution these hundreds of thousands of men and their families, and I think that's we have to give a little bit of credit to the deep sophistication, actually, as Matt has said, that belies the level of cooperation and ability to wage this multi-front resistance to what was once perceived as the only capable institution in the country. So, and as I think you were saying about the joint statement, a lot of the kinds of conversations, and dialogue, and negotiations ongoing are not necessarily visible, right? And they may not be visible. And you expressed some questions about, well, why aren't some of the actors signatories? I'm not worried. I wouldn't be worried. And I think we have to also understand that there are going to be constraints in terms of what can and cannot be public, but to also appreciate that I think all actors in this resistance understand the value of open channels of communication, first and foremost with each other. And really a lot of the activities that have taken place over the past 3 years would not be possible without the depth of communication and cooperation that takes place in the background. The idea of what comes next, and I think we put aside the concerns of whether there is this vacuum. And again, I would push back on that framing. If Myanmar can be deoccupied, so to speak, of the military and its politics and its political economy, and if key actors can come together, the question then is, well, are the interests aligned? Are they going to be able to work things out? Will there be fragmentation? Will they push for disintegration? And I think again here we do not give enough credit and respect. I think we should understand the sentiment, right? I think we should allow for the fact that yes, there is deep-rooted grievances and frustration with the history of the center in Myanmar, and a very particular kind of center, right? I'm also going to push back on the idea that it was a Burma center. No, it was a military organization that utilized the majority identity and majority ethnic group and religion and created a systemic form of discrimination, again, deployed systematic violence. The effect of the center on the peripheries, on the different minority communities in the country, yes, there is frustration. But I think also during this period, there's also an understanding among key leaders that the only way you prevent that from happening again in the future is that you have a stake in the center, right? And by carving out your own part of what is currently Myanmar, does not guarantee that kind of lasting peace. And I think we have to credit key actors with the ability to rationalize. And this is not new, right? This is fundamental to the history of organizations like the KIA and their leadership, organizations like the KNU. You go back to what they were saying in the 80s and the 90s. That awareness is there. You do not let the center, if you do not want the center to run amok, you need a stake in it, and you need a fair and equal stake in it. And I think that hasn't been allowed, and I think this current moment will be what creates that space. And I think we need to be, again, a bit optimistic that this is doable. If the space is given, if the resources to enable that kind of dialogue are provided. One last thing I think I wanted to say, we talk about specific issues, going back to potential conflicts around territory. How will these divisions be demarcated? I think some of you have also covered this issue that we don't have to rush to start dividing lines, right? We also have to reframe whether it is territory that will define a state. I mean, not for anything, at least for the National Unity Government, for the NUG. I think the NUG, for all its weaknesses, challenges, and one of the things that's demonstrated, I would argue, is that you can create, you can adopt, you can establish, you can act with certain features of a state without being physically in control, right? If we think about the trajectory of how the NUG emerged, you can claim a legal precedent or a threat to legitimacy. You can work off of public support inside the country, but also, again, among the Burmese diaspora. I mean, what has funded and financed and resourced this movement? It's not the international community, right? It's the Burmese in Myanmar, but also the Burmese communities and the Burmese diaspora across the country. And the NUG and other actors, I think, have demonstrated how you can bring together technology, you can bring together, I think, really creative and innovative solutions to at least assume some of the features of what a sovereign is. And I think in the discussions that move forward with key actors, again, in the country on what a future setup for Myanmar looks like, we can assume there will be that same kind of innovative thinking and flexibility, and a recognition that we don't have to get conventional sometimes. I was in a discussion a couple of weeks ago, and we had a number of different stakeholders from civil society, I think from some of the key political organizations, and there was a Muslim colleague of mine that he brought up this case of Balawa, right? So Balawa is a township right on the boundary between what is currently Rakhine State and what is currently Chin State. And Balawa is seen as a very strategic town because it provides access to the west towards Bangladesh and India. And Balawa is seen as contentious. Balawa is seen as a potential trigger point, not just for conflict with the military, but also conflict between the Chin and the Rakhine. And he said, you don't have to have a presence. Why don't you just get the different actors to agree for a rite of passage, the right to use, but also commit to not creating a security presence, a military presence on either side, or you can invite third-party mediation. And I think for some of the other participants in the room, you could see that notion sort of click, and they hadn't considered that as a possibility. And my point in telling this story is sometimes it's just bringing the right ideas to the table. I think it's being flexible, and I think encouraging flexibility in what we think should be the setup. And I think with the willingness to keep those channels open, and I think with the right kind of support, there are many possible ways in which we can avert the failure to implement peace in the country. And I think we can at least keep optimistic about the things that are possible, because again, let's not get too stuck on what the military did and didn't do. Yeah, I'm going to stop here.
Thanks very much, Nyanto, and to everybody. We'll turn to questions very shortly, but I'd like to pick up on, try and draw together a few things you said into maybe a question for you and anybody else of the panel who wants to weigh into it. And we've had a little bit of discussion about this, and sorry to boil it down to a very simplistic thing, but concerning this question of day two, what if we all know that it's not going to be neat? There actually won't be any moment where, the junta falls and suddenly the resistance takes over, and we've just highlighted some of the problems in that. In a vast and very diverse resistance, there's no monolithic, unifying central order of things that has been widely agreed to, but there is one. And the one document I think I've seen the one kind of loose thing attempt to mean something to all the resistance groups is this draft constitution, which has been kicking around and was initially a very hastily done transition, what do you call it, whatever it was called in the early days, a kind of hastily done instant charter of sorts that was intended to replace the 2008 constitution, which all resistance groups have basically rejected. So that has been sort of making do, and now there is a full draft document in the wings that very few groups have seen, actually. So how important is, to all of you actually, how important do you think this document is? And the notion that you can get all the groups to sign on to one when it is actually seen very broadly as linked to the NUG, which is seen as broadly Burma, NLD, linked and influenced, and also the NUCC, which is supposed to be a consultative body that includes ethnic groups, sectoral groups, etc. But I think that is just, as you pointed out, just one part and maybe an effort to have a centre and reinforce that. I mean, in very short answer. Sorry about the question.
Yeah, I think rather, we also have to be careful not to make constitution drafting a project, right? I think as an exercise is important. I think there's political value in the optics of working together on it, right? And certainly in the signing off. But unless we, again, talk about the principles, and the principles are being discussed, and unless we sequence the discussion right, we can't get locked into certain processes. I think we need to be willing sometimes that if something isn't working, you can change it. And there's a beauty in one of the, if you look at a lot of the key emergent actors and organizations, there's a beauty to the use of the term interim, right? This is the interim NUG. This is the interim executive council of Karenni. And the point about interim is that there's a sunset to this, and new things can follow. And I think that's the kind of mindset that key actors can take.
Thank you very much. Matt, I know you had something to say.
Yeah, I don't want to get too deep into semantics, but I do think it is important that they call it a charter, not a constitution. I mean, this was meant to be, a document that outlines, the wider parameters for how things might unfold, roughly what might be called a roadmap, or give some direction to what happens. And I think what's been clear from the beginning of this goes back to March, April 2021, was that there always was going to be a transition government. There was always going to be a transition period, and that the NUG is meant to get to day one, and that the transition period is a step to a future political settlement. And I think we have to give credit for that. We can argue how the NLD role, et cetera, but I think what's clear amongst the key stakeholders within the country is that there is going to be a transition period, and that fundamentally it needs to be free of a junta looming over it that fundamentally corrupts the prospects for a different kind of agreement.
Thank you. Jay, did you have something you're looking for?
We've had a lot of constitutions in Thailand.
How many?
20. Could be 19, 20. But so constitutions really are a function of something else. Function and instrument of broader understanding, collective will, including goodwill, and a spirit. Constitution is about spirit. So I'd say two things. I mean, you don't have to start from zero, which means that there has been a constitution from 2008, and it was about power sharing. It was about civil military power sharing. So I think that moving forward, you don't need a hard constitution, but some kind of certainly a written document that has a spirit of power sharing in a kind of a moving balance. There was a balance for the 2008 Constitution. Gradually, it opened up the space, 2011 to 2021, but then it broke down. I think miscalculations for many reasons. So I think that for Myanmar, look at Thailand, right? The Constitution, 1997, 2007, 2017, the one we have now, is the source of many problems in Thailand. It's so unbalanced. So it's not about having a written document. Actually, it can be counterproductive.
So you're saying it's not necessary, or it's not essential to a day two scenario?
I think first you need a kind of a spirit behind it. The Constitution to look at for Thailand would be 1997. It was a reaction to the 1991-1992 coup and violence. And there was a kind of a consensus, a broad consensus that we need a written document to get out of this cycle of coups and elections and constitutions. And for a while, it worked for a while, and then it got kind of subverted, and now we have constitutions, the last two, going in the wrong direction, in my view. So I think for Myanmar, it's a lesson that I think 2008 was a power sharing kind of constitution written document. But at the end of the day, it's a function of something else, and that something else has to be a spirit of compromise and power sharing.
Thank you. Oh, you want, yep.
Referring to the 1997 constitution in Thailand, it took a long time for Thailand to draft this constitution because the constitution drafting committee members were even elected. So it's still dubbed the most democratic constitution that we've ever had. But speaking about constitution in general in this country is very risky. And I think for me, for Myanmar also, constitution is a law which is broad, which is general. Just like in Thailand, now the Thai society has a lot of issues with the constitutional court, and they have ruled out so many weird things. So for me, constitution can be dangerous. I agree with all your opinions that at the end of the day, it comes down to the spirit of the collaboration between ethnic groups, and of course NUG, NUCC, and whatnot. So yeah, I'll leave it right there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have other questions, but I'd like to turn it over to the floor. And if you do have a question, just raise your hand. I think most people have a microphone there.
My name is Kasit Pirom. I'm a fellow at ISIS also, but at the same time, I'm a board member of the ASEAN Parliamentarian for Human Rights. And we have been doing a hell of a lot of work on the Myanmar thing, and would like to be in close touch with all the panelists for the days to come. Maybe we could work together to find out about the peacemaking in Myanmar. I have two short questions. One to all the panelists. What would be the possibility of the Tatmadaw disintegrating? They have to come to the negotiating table. Second, could we start thinking of the UN interim administration, which ASEAN did have that experiences after the withdrawal of Vietnam from Cambodia? Thank you.
Questions to the Dr. Arnold. Could you please share about the source of your data? Because it looks like we have a satellite under the Myanmar and we can fix any case of shooting. It's a lot of data. We're asking because we have not only a military conflict inside the country physically, but also conflict at the newspapers, it's informational conflict also. And when we try to understand what really happening now in Myanmar, we read two types of sources, two types of papers. One of them from the current military government, another one from the opposite side. So it's absolutely different figures, and it looks like propaganda from both sides. The second question to any speaker: why we idolize previous government? Why we say that the junta is something bad, and but previous government it's a good. I'm not specialist in this country, but my question is what happened with Rohingya during the previous government. The third, have we any person inside this auditorium who visited Myanmar during past 3 years? Maybe.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Have we
Anyone visited what?
Myanmar past 3 years physically? Maybe past 1 year, maybe months. It will be very interesting to hear about what this person saw. About the prognosis of for any war. It's my personal vision.
Thank you.
It's yes.
Okay.
Can you also tell us who you are, please?
Very short about the prognosis. Can we remember the Korean War?
No, sorry. I think the question was, could you identify yourself as well?
Sorry. My name is Vitaly Alexandrov. I am from the Embassy of Kazakhstan here in Thailand.
Thank you.
Okay.
Just wondering that. Thank you very much. So I think we can turn first to Kun Kasit's excellent questions. Also that very interesting point about an interim UN proposal for a UN interim body. Would any of you like to start off with addressing Kun Kasit's questions? Nyata? Oh, yes. Sure.
I was looking at maps and just wanted to collapse.
Okay, sure. Matt?
I think it's an interesting point. Kun said disintegration, collapse is the role for negotiation with the junta. I mean, I've mapped out different scenarios. There is a possibility that the junta does just collapse, and that it. I mean, we've seen this in other countries where a ruling military dictatorship just does collapse and is quickly replaced. But there are other scenarios, probably more of them, whereby there is some kind of negotiation, either for some kind of accommodation or for a wider surrender. So there is a range of scenarios for what happens. Personally, though, I think it goes back to this thing is going to continue to snowball, and the window for the junta to negotiate anything substantial is diminishing. And the longer, the weaker it becomes militarily, the less and less people will be interested in talking to it. I think in terms of the UN, personally, I don't see a UN role as too significant. I mean, the UN has an image problem within the country. It's hard to see the UN being accepted as a good faith actor working on behalf of the country towards a better future. Data source, I use different commercial reporting. They include both sides. They include media outlets that would be considered more pro-resistance, but also media outlets that would be considered more pro-military. When I present data, I don't. It's not an exact presentation of history or reality. It's an approximation, and what I talk about overall is wider trajectories about what has happened. I think that is possible. Where people do direct verification of incidents on the ground, inherently it tends to focus on very specific things like certain types of human rights violation or the use of, say, certain types of military assets like airplanes or helicopters. But for wider kind of conflict monitoring, tracking, it's possible to get an overall sense of what is happening within the country. I think just on, please.
Nyanta, yes.
Yeah, I think I'll get back to Jan's question, but just on that very interesting question, I don't think no one has idolized the previous government actually, relative to this current junta even. But there's certainly, a discourse around the challenges of having what was essentially a dual-headed state, right? You essentially had a military that even over the past, the 5 years where you had an NLD administration, but also the 5 years before under a USDP majority administration, you had a military that was very much in control of the key organs of state. And the commonality, I think, with all the different political actors, barring the military, barring the SAC, during this period, post-coup, no one has talked about or idolized the previous administration. They've talked about the difficulties that maybe they faced relative to their ability to, whether their capacity or their ability to push back on the military encroachment into the organs of state. But I don't think there's any idolization. And that is why a lot of the discourse is very much about not going back to that system, right? You talked about, Ajahn, you talked about the 2008 Constitution. The 2008 Constitution is more or less roundly seen by everyone at this point as a failure to accommodate both the military and a civilian administration in that kind of power-sharing construct if there is constant encroachment, if they are able to pull off military offenses, right? Offensives, as had happened in Rakhine, with very real actual veto power or control from any part of the civilian administration. But it also wasn't a guarantee, again, for the rights and the liberties and the aspirations of the different communities in the country. There was no real path to accommodate the various resistance actors that have predated this coup, that have been resisting the center, right? These are the ethnic armed organizations, ethnic resistance organizations, revolutionary organizations, call them what you will. That peace process had already hit a quagmire under the 2008 Constitution. So very much, I think, if there's one thing you will find consensus on in Myanmar, is not just about the junta, but that system overall prior to the coup just wasn't working.
Lalita, I think you have.
Okay, I'll reply to Kun Kasit's question just a bit. I'll try to do it. In the NUG joint statement, if you read through it, there is a room for negotiation with the junta. I don't know how to make of this, but I think it's at the end of the day, if you think of Myanmar as a country, as a unit, in order to reform the military, in order to to make them to make the whole Myanmar more inclusive, then at the end of the day, you need their part to reform or to have a say on this. I know this is highly controversial, but the Thermidor is still there. There's no deny. So for Ajahn Kasit, I think it's very important also for Thailand to be more proactive. ASEAN also to be more proactive on Myanmar on this. As far as I know, right now it's a best time for Myanmar's neighboring countries to try to mediate or facilitate talks among different stakeholders from Myanmar. But I would like to urge the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Thailand a bit more to be more courageous on their Myanmar policy. I know for sure that Kun Panpri, the minister, has been very much interested in this Myanmar issue, and he sincerely thinks that Thailand could do more about this. But what happens now in Thailand, things that I can share with you, is that different organs, governmental organs, they don't communicate enough. the army knows a lot of things. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they know a lot as well, but they don't necessarily share their insights. Sometimes they just want to keep their secrets, for themselves. So I think this is a great time. It's a critical time for everyone, not just for Myanmar people, but also for Thailand. I've been talking about this endlessly. People at the ministry might be annoyed by me by now, but this is very important, and I really hope that forums like this, seminars like this would play a big role in shaping Thailand's policy towards Myanmar in years to come. Thank you.
Thanks, Ajahn. And I can see you want to say something. Can I also add to you, Ajahn? I don't know. Could you, maybe you talked about Thailand hedging their bets and the mistake of the previous administration being not recognizing that moment where they should have allowed or introduced some options. And now with the whole, I think it's just the beginning. What we're seeing Thailand moving towards this humanitarian cross-border situation, which at the moment a lot of criticism is being aimed at Thailand for, forming the task force with the junta in Naypyidaw and actually not officially giving any leeway to any prospect of below radar assistance into ethnic controlled areas, with employing ethnic groups and resistance groups themselves. But anyway, would you say that this could give us some confidence that bets are being hedged, and would that be a little too late, too little too late, or is there a chance that this could actually change the game?
Changing the game is something else, but I think it's not too late. It's not too late. I mean, a lot of damage has been done to Thai foreign policy, Thailand's Myanmar policy, but I think that, as I've said, there has been a qualitative shift, a realization. I think it took them some time, the senior diplomats and government, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to get their heads around the fact that this is an unwinnable war for the Myanmar military. It's really hard to believe that, and a lot of people still don't, have a hard time accepting this reality. I think there has been a shift. I actually think the Ministry of Foreign Affairs now they're getting it, but bear in mind also that previously in the previous government we were so far the other way. I mean, there was such a deficit that it takes time to come in a more kind of a constructive, productive direction. Just a quick point to the visit to Myanmar. Borderland visits, okay. Going back to Naypyidaw Yangon, I'm afraid I'll be arrested, so I don't go back there. But and this is very common to a lot of people of all the things I've said and written about Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, and then the way that they treat people, their own people. But to the UN role, it's already been mentioned the UN is not well perceived, and Cambodia would be a different case. There was more obligation to seek a resolution, an international coalition around Cambodia because of all the Vietnam War and China wars and so on. And they had a civil war, part of the Cold War, and there were clear factions, right? 3 factions versus the Heng Samrin government. So very kind of clear internal conflict. I mean, here we have multi-fronts, multi-players in a civil war in Myanmar. So Myanmar, I think, is a case of not a moral obligation, but more goodwill of international community if they want to have a role. But it's not going to be UN-led, not going to be UNCTAD, like in May 1993 election in Cambodia. I just want to say that, SAC Constitution 2008, remember that the military thought that, SPDC time, Tan Shwe's time, that they had a constitutional design that would secure their interests over time. 25% they had, for themselves, and then the other 75% they figured, they can kind of play with, and all they had to do is win a third, but they couldn't do that. And then I think 2020 was really the threshold. I still think that this power sharing spirit of compromise behind a constitutional design like that could have carried on, could have been sustained. And I still think that it was Senior General Min Aung Hlaing. He was much to blame for miscalculating that whole period, after the election in November 2020. He was retiring, I think, in July 2021. Had he been reassured somehow that he would have a role and the military would be okay, it could have carried on. This was really he really made a big mess. And I think that General Min Aung Hlaing, in his some moments, he would think that he really made a big mess of everything, and he is going to suffer for it. So I still think that there is the SAC to be dealt with, minus Senior General Min Aung Hlaing. And in fact, ironically, and I think this is not going to be popular for a lot of Myanmar stakeholders, you still need the SAC, not SAC, you still need the military. SAC minus Min Aung Hlaing, but in the broader Myanmar armed forces, they have to have a place at the table. They're indispensable in the mix moving forward.
Briefly.
Okay, very briefly, and then we'll have to.
The military is the one who screwed up the transition. They alone did this. They staged a coup during a transition for a constitution which they had written. They bear responsibility for that. More widely, though, I would say on a road to peace or disintegration, this notion of a transition, in quotes, i.e. some kind of internationally backed, facilitated, financially supported transition, I don't think people want to return to that, because fundamentally it didn't deal with the root of the problem. It didn't deal with what was essentially a failed premise, which was the military could somehow maintain its centrality to the country's politics, economics, and governance. So I think it'll be a hard sell to push a return to that type of transition again. I take Jay's wider point. I would say Myanmar does need a military. It just doesn't need this military. By the time it's defeated, I don't see any credible officers remaining at a senior level who can be negotiated with, because they all have so much blood on their hands. And then in their stead, we have a whole new generation of resistance actors who, by and large, haven't waged campaigns of massive atrocities, i.e. there's people to work with here. But I take your point that there does need to be consideration of a national military and how that's woven into the political process.
Right. I note that the NUG and resistance group statement that Ajahn Lalita referred to does actually offer talks with what they call responsible military leadership. I think everyone was saying, who do they mean? There really isn't someone you could identify. So I think that is an issue, but that's the topic of another whole seminar, I think. And I hope we do have another one before too long on maybe another aspect of this
Quick
important
question.
and fascinating. Okay, we'll leave the last question to.
I hope you hear me. I just want to ask about the role of China in terms of peaceful situation. It's sort of had a shifting view throughout the conflict. It's thought to give a tacit nod to Operation Central instead of them negotiated a ceasefire, which hasn't really held. But how is China going to intervene or influence in the process?
I'm originally from the Sakai region. I came to here previous week. So I have a very simple question for Dr. Madru. So my question is simple. What kind of local governance should be settled or something in current present situation in Myanmar? Because I think we control a lot of speed in the ground. So currently, since we also started in some kind of local government in the ground. So many areas like township or municipal or something like that in our in the ground, right? Because my thinking is clear. What is the sources of power? Sources of power is our village or our community. So we hold all kind of power. So even though NUG or EAO are not important in current situation, this is reality in the ground, right? So I ask this kind of question because of a road to peace or conflict. It's not important. We just need to, as a community figure, we just need to stimulate and rethinking social cohesion in every in our community. Once we got that kind of share, we can build a peaceful community, right? So I ask that kind of question.
Okay, thanks. So very quickly, Matt, would you like to take on that question? Maybe you could I think some of us didn't quite get that.
I mean, the question was, what is the role of local government, sources of power? How does that impact the future direction? I mean, I go back to my earlier point that I see this fundamentally as a bottom-up revolution, that it started at the community level and aggregated from there. I think the wider point in this is that in Myanmar's history, I don't think we've ever had a population that feels more empowered or involved in the wider picture. And certainly at a community level, I mean, we have communities that have not only been involved in armed resistance, but have created schools and local administration, police units, et cetera, that fundamentally these communities have a role already and will demand a role in the future, and they're an immense source of power. And when we talk about federalism in Myanmar or the future political settlement, I don't see it as a two-level question, the union level and the state level. We also need to talk about local level, because this is the type of war that has fundamentally empowered local communities, and they'll demand that third or fourth tier of local government. Just briefly on the China role, I think China is a great power. It'll inherently have a great role. I'm not sure China, though, has a grand plan for what happens in Myanmar. I'm not sure anybody does. And I think China's own strategic rationale calculus is changing quickly and fundamentally, because it does have to deal with this notion that it's just there to protect its strategic interests. That is starting to come into question, because the junta is collapsing more widely. And so I think China does have a role. But in terms of, it's going to have to diversify its own engagement away from just the Northern Brotherhood Alliance. It'll have to start thinking wider. It has had a hedging strategy. It'll have to get more involved in Myanmar overall. But then at the same time, that raises the obvious point, which is that it's in the interest of other countries to also think beyond the junta, especially countries like India and Thailand, to say, well, don't come to this too late, because otherwise you're going to be playing catch up. You'll be at a disadvantage, and you'll probably come out of it worse than you could have.
Wouldn't you say that's what Thailand's doing right now?
Not really. No.
Oh, really? Oh, well, that's another whole debate. Jay, would you like to
China question is a good one. It also can be raised for India as well. Bangladesh, Laos, a bit different, but I see that China, India, Thailand, these are key countries for what's going to happen in Myanmar, and in broader context of ASEAN. So China, the SSC is isolated now, Ambassador Pat. It was the Chinese green light, partly the Operation 1027, and from the scam centers. All those the Chinese being preyed on, exploited along this borderland area. So finally they put a stop to it. And over time, I think China's been, would have been more happier with the pre-coup than the post-coup. It's a big mess for China. India, I think, so China now, I think, is getting on and now catching up with the curve, and maybe even staying a little bit ahead. India is still behind the curve. And I think that they're still trying to get their heads around the fact that, again, Myanmar military is going to lose, but they're coming around to it. They also, for these last 3 years, India has had a lot at stake because of this corridor they had with their landlocked northeast states. But now they will have to make the adjustment about what to do, and then they want to secure the Chin areas, the Gang. I can see that China wants to secure the the Chin state, and then the Shan Wa. For Thailand, it want to secure the borderlands along the the Shan, southern Shan, and then the Karen, and Amon. So you look around the major countries. I mean, they will have an interest in securing their borderland areas. This is why the SAC is now completely isolated, no backing from China, and certainly it used to be backed a little bit by Russia selling arms, so Russia now has its hands full with the Russian aggression in Ukraine. So I think it comes down to Thailand, ASEAN. China has to have a place at the table, and India will have a place at the table. It will want to. But to find a way forward is really, I hope, ASEAN and maybe Thailand in that mix, in the Troika mix, complementing the Troika, and then maybe we can find a way forward, with the local domestic various stakeholders.
Can I ask if you know whether the Troika formula is going ahead under the Lao special envoy? I gathered he wasn't so keen on the formulaic Troika.
This is a problem with ASEAN, right? So you have these different chairmanships, and it comes to Laos, you have your own special envoy. So in fact, the special envoy on Myanmar should be a longer term position, shouldn't rotate year to year. So it was not emphasized, this Troika, and partly because Indonesia is out. Indonesia not out, but it just it has the election this month, and then the election will take some time. They'll have a new government not until like October. So it's really up to Malaysia. Malaysia is still good. I mean, all in. And then Thailand now shifting a little bit. So I'm hoping Thailand, Malaysia with some Indonesia backing cooperation, and then maybe some Laos kind of, going along, or at least some concession, because Laos is in the hot seat. And then with China shifting now on the SAC, Laos will have more space to work with. So I'm hoping that modality, Troika plus Thailand, with Indonesia in the back because of the election, maybe that would be kind of a gateway, a facilitating mechanism moving forward.
Thank you. Nyanto, I know you wanted to. Lalita? Okay.
I think one of the greatest challenges for Thai Ministry of Foreign Affairs is that they're not that independent. Whatever they think, whatever is on board, they have to think about China, they have to think about the US and so on. I think it's now, as I said earlier, it's a right time for the people, policymakers here in Thai. I'm talking on behalf of a Thai citizen, to be more brave and to be more just to have policies that are more independent from superpower politics. Yeah, I have been talking with more junior diplomats at the ministry. Diplomats in their 30s, they're excellent and they take Myanmar issues seriously. But one thing that they voiced to me, which is very interesting, is that no matter how much they try, no matter how many papers they have produced, it's very, very hard to reach to the high level of the Puyai level, which means senior people at the ministry. With the presence of Kun Kasit here, I would like to echo this as well, that it's very important that Puyai in the ministry buys this idea, and they think that this issue is urgent and things that they must do right now. Thank you.
Excellent point. And final word to you, Nyanta.
Just very quickly, I think Thailand is actually more interesting, but just briefly on China. I mean, China has interests in Myanmar, and therefore it will, continue to play an influential role. And it has demonstrated, I think, in different ways how that role can be played. And irrespective of the range of scenarios that can emerge over the next few years, I think among the countries that border Myanmar, China is the only country I see at the moment that is prepared to accommodate all possible outcomes. On Thailand, I think that's where it's a question, that I think you're beginning to address as well, where Thailand has interests in Myanmar, and the interests in Myanmar that Thailand has, I think, often get portrayed very simplistically to me as an outsider to Thailand, in very simplified terms. It's about gas. It's about the refugees and migrant labor and cross-border migration and human trafficking, and it's so simplified even for a Thai audience, it looks like, but I would argue it goes beyond that, right? I think the agri-food linkages that two countries have are immense. I think in terms of over the past year, in 2023, a lot of us have tried to raise this issue. Hey, you may have an emerging healthcare crisis along the border, a crisis in terms of the spread and rise of infectious diseases, in particular, drug-resistant strains of malaria. That's not just a health issue, that's a security issue for Thailand, right? Because what happens on the border or inside Myanmar doesn't stay on the border and inside Myanmar, and it's always at risk of, and is, I think, over the past 14 months, moving into Thailand. And you talk to different stakeholders along the border. I think Thai health officials in Tak and Mesen and the districts that border Myanmar are very aware. I just don't know if there's that same kind of discussion happening in Myanmar. And it's not a healthcare issue. To me, it's a security issue, right? The issue of labor, this is an economy that has actually benefited in some sense from war. We saw the figures last year in terms of real estate investments in Bangkok. This is capital flight from Myanmar being captured by the Thai economy. So I think when you begin to expand what interests in Thailand are in the Thai discourse for a Thai audience, maybe that's one of the ways in which we can get the attention of the senior leaders.
Right. And on that note, I would, unless there's anything burning, I would really like to. Khun Kasit.
The two very short sentences. One is that on the 1st to the 3rd of March, there will be a big seminar organized by, I think, 2 committees of the House of Representatives on Myanmar. And I will be giving a keynote address. And in that sense, I would welcome all the points. You can send it to me, and I will incorporate in my speech. And I think Dr. Lalita might know about this. Secondly, I suggest that could ISIS summarize this meeting of ours and send it direct to the foreign minister. I think there is some problem inside where we will never, ordinary beings cannot get directly in touch with the foreign minister. And I think ISIS can do it, or Chulalongkorn. And that might be very helpful because all the substances of the conversation, I think, would be very useful to him. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Khun Kasit. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming today, and particularly to our great panelists. Thank you.